They came riding across the grasslands like thunder on the horizon, fast, relentless, unstoppable. Their hoofbeats shook the earth, and their arrows fell in waves, sudden and unyielding, like rain before a storm. These were no builders of walls or cities. The sky was their shelter, the wind their boundary, and the open plain their home. From the mouth of the Danube to the snow-bound mountains where the land rises into cloud and silence, they claimed a world not with monuments, but with movement, memory, and the strength of the bond between rider and horse. In the beginning was the great emptiness, not the void before creation, but the magnificent desolation of the Eurasian plains. From the wine-dark waters of the Pontic Sea, eastward beyond counting, the grasslands rolled like a frozen ocean, unbroken by tree or hill, swept by winds that carried the scent of 1,000 different flowers and the promise of horizons that no man could reach in a lifetime of riding. Here, beneath a dome so vast it pressed down like the vault of heaven itself, the greatest revolution in the history of warfare would be born. For uncounted generations, these lands had known tribes, farmers who scratched the black earth along river valleys, herders who followed their flocks in endless circles, hunters who tracked mammoth and aurochs through meadows tall enough to hide a standing man. But these were earthbound folk, tied to water and woodland, moving like ants across the immensity of the verdant sea. The true children of the plains had not yet been born. The transformation began in the mists of antiquity, when the great migrations swept like tides across the world. From the heartland between Persia and the northern mountains came the Iranian-speaking tribes, their wagons creaking under the weight of bronze and hope, their cattle lowing complaints to an indifferent firmament. Wave after wave they came, each generation pushing further west, following the green roads that only they could read. These were not yet the horse lords, not yet. They were the ancestors, the foundation upon which a greater nation would rise. First came those who would leave their name to places, the builders of Andronovos settlements scattered like islands across the prairie sea, workers of bronze who raised their dead beneath small mounds and dreamed dreams their descendants would make real. After them rode the Srubnaya tribes, masters of the timber grave culture, who learned to read the language of rivers and began the long conversation between man and horse that would reshape the world. But before the plains could birth their greatest children, an older nation had to pass into shadow. The Cimmerians held the western grasslands when the world was young, dark riders who swept down from the north, like winter storms, their iron weapons singing songs of death and conquest. For generations beyond counting, they ruled the lands between the Crimean peaks and the great bend of the Tanais, that mighty river which marks the boundary between Europe and Asia in the geography of the heart, if not the map. These ancient horsemen were mighty in their day, feared from the gates of Assyria to the forests of Thrace. Their name became a byword for terror among the civilized nations who cowered behind their walls, praying to their gods for deliverance from these savage riders who appeared like shadows and vanished like smoke. When their bronze-pointed arrows whistled overhead, wise men knew that winter had come regardless of the season, that the world was about to change in ways that could not be foreseen or prevented. Still, even the Cimmerians, for all their terrible strength, were not the ultimate children of the meadows. They remained too tied to the old ways, too bound by the limitations that flesh places upon spirit. Their horses were mounts, not partners. Their bows were weapons, not extensions of their souls. They rode across the prairie without truly becoming one with it, conquerors rather than native sons of the infinite grassland. The true revolution came with the marriage of man and horse in ways the world had never seen. Somewhere in the vast reaches between the Altai peaks and the Carpathian forests, a nation arose who understood that the plains demanded not conquest but symbiosis, not domination but partnership with the forces that ruled the verdant sea. These were the first of the horse lords, though they would not bear the name history remembers for generations yet to come. This shift unfolded over more than just one season and more than one life. It grew like meadow flowers after rain, slowly at first, then with gathering speed till it covered the world. The key was the composite bow, that marvel of horn and sinew and wood that could drive an arrow through bronze armor at distances that made spear throwers seem like children playing with sticks. In the hands of a master horseman, this weapon turned the entire prairie into a fortress whose walls were space itself and whose defenders were the wind. But the bow alone could not have created this new way of life. The horse was equally important, not the heavy destriers that carried armored warriors in distant lands, but the swift ponies of the plains, hardy as winter, enduring as stone, capable of living on meadow grass and snow when grain-fed mounts would starve. These animals became more than tools or symbols. They became the other half of a partnership that would rule half the world. When horse and bow came together in the hands of a nation that had learned to think in terms of vast distances and endless movement, the way of the nomad kings was born. No longer would warriors fight in dense masses, shield pressed against shield, spear against spear. No longer would victory go to those who could stand firm in one place, while their enemies broke themselves against walls of bronze and iron. War became a dance across enormous spaces, a game of pursuit and withdrawal, where speed mattered more than armor and intelligence more than brute strength. The first records of these new warriors come to us through the eyes of their enemies, filtered through the fearful reports of Assyrian scribes who recorded their raids like astronomers marking the passage of comets. Ashkuza, they called them, and Ishkuza, names that carry the sound of arrows singing through air and hoofbeats drumming against the earth. To the east, other chroniclers spoke of Saka tribes, horse nomads who appeared on the borders of the civilized world like wolves testing the edges of a flock. But the name that would echo through eternity came from the Greeks, those lovers of precise words and careful distinctions. Scythi, they called the horsemen who controlled the northern shores of the Euxine Sea, and by this title they have remained in the memory of mankind. Whether the name came from their own tongue or was a gift from their southern neighbors matters less than the terror and wonder it came to inspire. When men spoke of the horse lords, they spoke of riders who could loose arrows while hanging from their horses' necks, of armies that appeared like mirages and vanished like smoke, of a nation that had made mobility itself into a philosophy of war. The legends they told of their own origins were grander than any foreign chronicler's account. Listen and hear how Tarjitaus, the God-born, came down from the heavens to the empty plains, his divine seed mingling with the daughter of the river Borysthenes to create the first of the royal line. 3 sons were born of this union, Lipoxias, Arpoxias, and Colaxias, names that ring like bronze against bronze when spoken by those who remember the old tongue. To test which of his grandsons would rule the horse tribes, Targetaus sent down from heaven 4 gifts wrought of gold: a plough, a yoke, a battle axe, and a cup. When Lipoxias the eldest approached, the golden implements burst into flame, driving him back with divine fire. Arpoxias, the middle son, suffered the same fate, the metal blazing too bright for mortal eyes to endure. But when Colaxias the youngest drew near, the flames died away like candles in a gentle breeze. and the gold lay cool and welcoming in his hands. Thus was the royal line established, and thus were the three great divisions of the horse tribes born. From Lipoxius came the Ocotai, the plough warriors who would till the black earth along the great rivers and grow the grain that fed cities. From Arpoxius descended the Catiari and Traspies, the nomad clans who would follow their herds across the endless meadows, living in felt houses that rolled with them wherever the seasons called. And from Colaxius, the flame-bearer, the gold winner, came the Paralatai, the royal bloodlines who would rule all the rest with wisdom learned from heaven and strength drawn from the earth itself. Whether this tale speaks truth in the manner of historical chronicles or in the deeper way of poetry matters less than its meaning. The horse lords understood themselves as children of two realms, the heavenly and the earthly, the divine and the mortal, the eternal and the temporal. Their kings claimed descent from gods, but their feet remained firmly planted in the black soil of the prairie. They were a nation balanced between the firmament and the verdant earth, drawing power from both, belonging fully to neither. What really happened, as scribes in distant places wrote with shaking hands, was conquest. The ancient masters of the western plains found themselves pressed from the east by riders, whose tactics they could not match and whose mobility they could not counter. Battle after battle went against them as their enemy refused to stand and fight in the old manner, preferring to dance away like shadows, striking and withdrawing, bleeding their opponents white through 1,000 small cuts, rather than seeking decision in a single great encounter. The retreat of the old order became a rout, then a migration, then a desperate flight that would carry the displaced tribes south through the Caucasus passes into Anatolia and beyond. Behind them came their conquerors, not to settle in the lands they had won, but to transform them into something the world had never seen, a kingdom without cities, an empire without walls, a realm whose boundaries were marked not by stone monuments, but by the reach of their horses and the flight of their arrows. These new rulers didn't replace the old. They turned power on the plains into something entirely new. Where the old masters had been raiders and warriors, the new rulers became administrators of mobility, organizers of controlled chaos. They divided the vast grasslands into grazing territories, established seasonal migration routes that took advantage of the best pasture and the most reliable water, created a system of communication that could carry messages faster than any empire the world had yet seen. Along the Tanais, that great river that flows like a silver sword from the northern forests to the Maeotian marshes, they established their primary boundary. East of its waters, the endless prairie rolled away toward the sunrise, inhabited by tribes who might be cousins or enemies depending on the season and the balance of power. West of the river lay their heartland, the Black Earth country, where the meadows grew thick as a man's wrist and the herds could fatten like merchants counting gold. But the horse lords were not merely herders grown ambitious or raiders become systematic. They understood, with the wisdom that comes from living close to both earth and heaven, that control of the verdant sea meant control of the roads that connected the civilized world. Caravans carrying silk from distant Ceres, amber from the Baltic shores, furs from the northern forests, precious metals from the mountain tribes, all had to cross the plains to reach their destinations. The horsemen became the toll keepers of Eurasia, masters of the greatest trade route the world had ever known. From their felt-covered wagons and seasonal camps, they watched the ancient kingdoms play their games of war and diplomacy, with the amusement of eagles observing ants. Egypt and Assyria Babylon, and Urartu, the Greek cities scattered like pearls around the rim of the sea, all seemed cramped and confined when viewed from horseback under the endless dome of heaven. What did it matter who ruled which city when the grassland itself had become a nation? When mobility had been transformed from a necessity into a philosophy? When freedom itself had taken the form of a confederation that owned nothing but their horses and their weapons, yet commanded distances that dwarfed any empire built of stone and bronze? These new tribal confederations were something entirely foreign to the so-called civilized world. The horse lords organized themselves not around cities or kings in the traditional sense, but around the rhythms of the plains themselves. Their society flowed like meadow winds, flexible yet strong, capable of gathering into vast armies when the need arose, or scattering into countless small bands that could vanish into the immensity of the grassland like drops of water absorbed by the earth. Leadership among them was earned rather than inherited, though royal bloodlines carried weight and honor. A man might be king of 10,000 riders, or chief of a single clan, but his authority rested ultimately on his ability to read the heavens for weather, the earth for pasture, the horizon for enemies. The prairie taught hard lessons about the price of failure, and those who could not learn found themselves ruling only the wind and their own shadows. The confederation that would become known to history as the royal bloodlines established its heartland in the lands between the Borysthenes and the Tanais, where the black earth was richest and the rivers ran deepest. Here they built their royal burial grounds, the sacred sites where kings would sleep beneath mounds of earth piled high as hills, surrounded by the goods they would need in the afterlife, and the servants who would attend them in death as they had in life. These were not cities in any sense that the Greeks or Persians would have recognized, but they served many of the same functions. They were gathering places where the scattered clans could come together for ceremonies and councils, markets where goods from a dozen different lands changed hands, sacred centers where the shamans performed the rituals that kept the confederation in harmony with the powers that ruled the celestial vault and the earth below. From these bases, the power of the horse lords spread like ripples in a pond. To the north, their influence reached toward the forests where the fur-bearing animals lived, and the amber gatherers plied their trade along the shores of distant seas. To the south, they pressed against the civilized kingdoms that had never faced enemies like these. Warriors who could strike without warning and vanish before retaliation could be organized, who treated vast distances as other men treated the space within their own courtyards. The world was about to learn what it meant to face the children of the firmament and the verdant earth, the horse tribes who had made the prairie itself into their weapon. From the shores of the wine-dark sea to the peaks where eagles nested, from the amber coast to the gates of the civilized kingdoms, the thunder of hoofbeats would soon announce that a new power had risen, one that would reshape the map of nations and rewrite the rules by which empires rose and fell. The age of the nomad kings had begun, and the world would never be the same. From the Black Earth country, between the Borysthenes and the Tanais, the royal bloodlines gathered their forces like eagles circling before the strike. No longer scattered bands following the seasons with their herds, they had become something far more dangerous. A confederation united by blood oaths and common purpose, bound together by the sacred fire that burned eternal in their heartland, and the golden vessels that held the blessing of their sky-born ancestors. The consolidation came not through conquest alone, but through the deeper alchemy of shared vision. Where once 100 petty chiefs had squabbled over grazing rights and waterholes, now the greatest among them knelt before Colaxius the gold-bearer, acknowledging him as first among equals, keeper of the sacred flames. speaker for the divine will that moved across the endless plains like wind across wheat. His word became law from the Crimean shores to the Amber rivers, his authority stretching as far as mounted messengers could ride and projectiles could fly from the weapons of his fighters. At the place where the Borysthenes stretches toward the wine-dark sea, a new dominion found its center. Here the royal bloodlines built their sacred places, not settlements of stone and timber like the settled folk, but sites of might where the earth itself had been shaped to hold the presence of the divine. Great earthen mounds rose like artificial hills, crowned with wooden temples where the eternal fire burned and the golden vessels caught the light of dawn and sunset in patterns that spoke to those who knew the ancient tongue. But while the horsemen built their influence in the heartland, older dynasties still held the western reaches. The last of the dark riders who had ruled before still commanded the lands between the Tiras and the Danube, their iron-pointed lances glinting in the morning light as they rode the boundaries of a shrinking realm. These were the final remnants of Cimmerian might, descendants of the storm riders who had once swept down from the northern forests to terrorize half the world. The confrontation, when it came, was less a single battle than a slow-burning war of movement and attrition that lasted through the changing of seasons. The old masters fought with the desperate courage of wolves backed against a cliff, knowing that defeat meant not just the loss of territory, but the end of their way of life. They had ruled these lands since their grandfathers' grandfathers first learned to shape iron and ride steeds in formation, and they would not yield easily to upstart nomads who claimed descent from the very fires of heaven. The tide of war flowed steadily against them. The mounted tribes had learned lessons that their enemies could not match: how to coordinate the movement of vast numbers across enormous distances, how to strike like lightning and vanish like morning mist, how to turn the very size of the grassland into a weapon against those who tried to hold fixed positions, where the old riders fought like their ancestors, in tight formations that relied on shock and momentum. The new masters danced around them like flames around a log, burning away their energy through countless small encounters that left no time for rest or recovery. The breaking point came when the royal bloodlines brought their full might to bear in the lands between the rivers. 50,000 riders, some said, though numbers lose meaning when applied to forces that moved like the migration of birds or the flowing of floodwaters. They came not in a single great host, but in waves, each contingent striking from a different direction, each attack timed to follow the last like thunder following lightning. Like bronze smashed by iron, the old order came undone. Those of the Cimmerian bloodlines who could escape fled toward the mountain passes, carrying word of their defeat to the kingdoms beyond the Caucasus. Others bent their necks to the new rulers, offering their swords and their knowledge of the western lands in exchange for place and honor among the victorious tribes. A few fought to the last, dying with weapons in their hands, rather than live to see their ancient territories ruled by foreign chiefs. Thus did the mounted lords become masters of all the grassland, from the Danube's mouth to the distant Tanais, rulers of a realm larger than any empire the world had yet seen. But their ambitions stretched beyond mere control of pasture and water rights. The defeated Cimmerians had shown them the way toward the mountain passes, where the great peaks stood like pillars, holding up the roof of the world, into lands where settlements glittered with gold, and armies marched in formations so dense they looked like forests of bronze-tipped spears. Like sudden summer storms, the early raids swept in with fury. Partatua the Far Rider led his mounted bands through the Darial Pass, that narrow gateway where the mountains press so close together that 100 men might hold back 10,000. Emerging into the fertile valleys beyond, like wolves, descending on a sheepfold. The settlements of Urartu, that ancient kingdom which had traded with Egypt when the world was young, suddenly found their borders swept by riders who appeared from nowhere and vanished into legend. But these were not mere cattle raiders grown bold. Partatua came bearing the authority of the royal bloodlines, speaking for kings who claimed descent from gods, and backing his words with steel that sang in the hands of 10,000 mounted archers. When he offered alliance to the Assyrian king, greatest of earthly monarchs, wise scribes took careful note of the terms. Here was a new force that demanded recognition, not as barbarous raiders, but as equals in the great game of nations. The partnership that followed reshaped the map of the ancient world. Assyrian gold flowed north to buy the services of mounted archers whose mobility could strike at enemies in places no conventional army could reach. In return, the riders learned the arts of statecraft and siege warfare, discovering how settled kingdoms managed their wealth and organized their territories. The alliance proved profitable for both sides, though wise men wondered what would happen when these swift learners no longer needed teachers. It was Mardius, the Stormbringer, who brought the challenge, Partatua's son, carrying forward his father's drive and his bonds with the kingdoms below. When revolt broke out in the Median lands, that mountainous country which controlled the roads between Mesopotamia and the eastern kingdoms, the Assyrian king called upon his northern allies for aid. Marius answered the summons with 40,000 riders, descending from the grassland like a plague of locusts to restore order in his own distinctive fashion. The Medians had never faced enemies like these. Their own cavalry, trained to fight in close formation with lance and sword, found themselves helpless against fighters who could loose projectile after projectile while riding at full gallop, who treated retreat as just another tactical maneuver and turned pursuit into ambush with practiced ease. Settlement after settlement opened its gates, rather than face siege by an army that moved too quickly to pin down and struck too hard to ignore. In the space of 7 years, the mounted lords became the real masters of Media, ruling through native princes, but holding the ultimate authority themselves. Tribute flowed northward to the grassland, while the fighters of the Confederation grew rich on the wealth of ancient kingdoms. Some took wives among the settled folk, learning their languages and customs. Others acquired tastes for luxuries unknown on the plains, silks from distant Ceres, spices from lands beyond the morning, wines aged in caves where the sun never shone. This empire carried within it the seeds of its own dissolution. The riders were children of movement and space, shaped by the endless rhythms of the grassland where no man could claim ownership of the wind or set boundaries to the migration of herds. The settled kingdoms demanded different virtues: patience, persistence, the ability to govern from palaces rather than saddles. Many of the younger fighters began to forget the old ways, preferring the pleasures of conquered territories to the harsh freedoms of their ancestors. The crisis came when Cyrus the Great of Persia, that lion among kings who would one day rule from the sunrise to the western sea, challenged the dominion of Astyages the Maid. The mounted confederations faced a choice that would define the future of their realm: stand with their old allies against this upstart Persian, or step aside and let the kingdoms below settle their own quarrels while the grassland remained free. Different tribes chose different paths, and for the first time since the days of Colaxius, the royal confederation split along lines of blood and ambition. Some rode toward the rebellious territories to support the Median king, who had paid them tribute for 28 years. Others offered their services to Cyrus, seeing in this young conqueror a kindred spirit who understood that the greatest victories came not from holding ground, but from seizing the moment. Still others withdrew entirely, leading their followers back to the Black Earth country, where the eternal fires burned and the old ways remained unchanged. Though brief, the war that followed changed everything. Cyrus proved himself a master of the swift strike and the unexpected maneuver, matching the rider's mobility with his own genius for adapting Persian tactics to meet each challenge. When the Median capital fell and Astyages found himself in chains, the empire of the grassland folk crumbled like a wall built on sand. But from defeat came knowledge that would serve the Confederation well in years to come. The survivors of Cyrus's victory brought back to the grassland hard-won understanding of how the settled world conducted its affairs, the importance of trade routes and tribute systems, the influence that came from controlling the passage between kingdoms, the wealth that flowed to those who could tax the caravans carrying goods from one end of the world to the other. Magius himself escaped the catastrophe, leading his remaining followers northward through familiar passes to the safety of the endless plains. Behind him, Cyrus continued his conquests, adding kingdom after kingdom to his growing empire. But when the Persian king turned his attention northward, seeking to extend his dominion over the grassland itself, he would discover that the mounted lords had learned from their defeat and would not be caught unprepared again. The return to the heartland brought renewal as well as refuge. The tribes that had remained loyal to the old ways welcomed back their cousins, with ceremonies that lasted from new moon to full. The sacred fires were rekindled with brands brought from the conquered territories, symbolically reclaiming the divine blessing that had been scattered in the wars below. New leaders emerged, chiefs who combined the ancient wisdom of the grassland with hard-won knowledge of the settled world's advantages and weaknesses. Among these was Idanthyrsus the Farseer, whose name would echo through history as the king who taught the world's greatest conqueror the limits of earthly dominion. Still young when Magius led the retreat from Media, he had learned the lessons of defeat without being broken by them. Under his leadership, the Confederation began to prepare for the storm they all knew was coming, the day when Cyrus or his successors would attempt to add the grassland to their collection of conquered provinces. The preparation was both military and spiritual. New tactics were developed that combined the traditional mobility of the riders with lessons learned from fighting alongside and against the armies of the settled kingdoms. The composite weapon remained supreme, but now it was complemented by improved armor and steel designed specifically for the kind of warfare the grassland demanded. Supply systems were organized that could support large armies in the field for extended periods, drawing on the vast herds that grazed across the endless plains. More importantly, the Confederation rediscovered its spiritual center. The priests and seers who had maintained the sacred traditions through the years of adventure below became teachers for a new generation of fighters, reminding them that their might came not from copying the ways of settled folk, but from perfecting their own ancient arts. The steed and composite weapon, wind and space, the blessing of the sky-born ancestors and the freedom of the endless grassland. These remained the true sources of their dominion. Trade, too, became a weapon in the coming struggle. The mounted lords had always controlled the routes between the northern lands and the kingdoms below, but now they systematized this advantage, creating a network of tribute and taxation that made their grassland realm wealthy beyond the dreams of simple herders. Gold flowed northward from the Greek settlements that dotted the shores of the Euxine Sea, payment for the grain that grew in the Black Earth country, and safe passage for the merchants who carried goods to and from the Amber Lands. The Greek colonies proved especially valuable allies, their ships providing access to trade routes that spanned the entire inland sea. their craftsmen producing goods that the riders could not make for themselves. Olbia, at the mouth of the Borysthenes, became almost a second capital of the Confederation, its warehouses filled with treasures from a dozen different lands, its streets busy with traders speaking as many languages as there were tribes between the mountains and the sea. Through these Greeks, the mounted lords began to understand their place in the larger pattern of nations and kingdoms that surrounded their grassland realm. To the west lay the barbarian tribes of Thrace, and beyond them the rising influence of Macedonia. To the east stretched the Persian Empire, now the greatest force the world had ever seen, reaching from the banks of the Indus to the shores of the Aegean. To the east, other mounted tribes grazed their herds and raided their neighbors, potential allies or enemies depending on the balance of dominion and the wisdom of their chiefs. But the grassland itself remained the key to everything. Here, in the Black Earth country, where the rivers ran deepest and the pasture grew richest, lay the heartland of a force that could challenge any empire the settled world might produce. The riders had learned to read the signs that spoke of approaching war, the movements of their enemies' armies, the shifting of alliances, the gathering of supplies, and the massing of ships. When the storm finally broke, they would be ready. The royal bloodlines gathered their might as their ancestors had done, but now with purpose sharpened by experience and wisdom hardened by defeat. The confederation that emerged from this crucible was more formidable than the sum of its parts, unified not just by blood and tradition, but by shared understanding of what they faced and what they had to lose. From the Crimean peaks to the Maeotian marshes, from the amber rivers to the wine-dark sea, the mounted lords prepared for the greatest test their way of life had ever faced. Somewhere beyond the passes, the Persian king was gathering the largest army the world had ever seen, preparing to add the grassland to his empire, just as he had added Egypt and Babylon, Lydia and the Greek settlements of Asia Minor. But the children of wind and space would not yield easily to the demands of earthbound kings. They had made the endless plains their fortress and the storm itself their ally. When the test came, the world would learn what it meant to challenge those who had made freedom itself into a philosophy of war, whose only boundaries were the horizons, and whose only master was the wind that blew across the grass like the breath of gods. In the rolling meadows, where the Borysthenes bends toward the sea, the end of life was not a conclusion, but a transformation, a passage from one form of existence to another, as natural as the changing of seasons or the migration of birds. The mounted tribes who had made mobility their philosophy extended that principle beyond the boundaries of mortal existence, believing that the spirits of the departed continued their eternal journey across prairies more vast than any earthly realm. The way of war among the royal bloodlines was unlike anything the settled kingdoms had witnessed, where civilized armies met in formal combat, shield wall against shield wall. The children of the plains fought like the wind itself, everywhere and nowhere, striking with the sudden fury of summer storms and vanishing like morning mist before their enemies could respond. Their tactics were born from the hunt, refined by generations of raiding, and perfected through bitter experience against foes who outnumbered them 10 to 1. The composite bow was their supreme advantage, that marvel of horn and sinew and seasoned wood that could drive a bronze-tipped shaft through armor at distances that made spear throwers seem like children with toy implements. In the hands of a master rider, one who had learned to shoot while hanging from his mount's neck or while galloping at full speed through broken terrain, this device became an extension of the fighter's will, as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. But the true terror they inspired came not from their armaments alone, but from what they did with their victories. The mounted tribes had learned that fear was often more valuable than conquest. that a reputation for supernatural cruelty could open gates that might otherwise require months of siege. When they took prisoners, the lucky ones perished quickly. The others became part of a ceremonial display designed to break the spirits of those who might resist. Scalping enemies served both a practical and ritual purpose, tallying victories while capturing the spirit of the fallen. The riders believed that a man's courage resided in his hair, and by taking these trophies, they absorbed their enemies' valor into themselves. The greatest champions wore cloaks made from hundreds of these grisly prizes, each scalp a testament to prowess in combat and a warning to those who might challenge them. More elaborate was the practice of flaying, reserved for the most important captives or the most hated enemies. The skin, carefully removed in a single piece, was then stretched and cured to make covers for quivers or decorations for shields. Some of the royal bloodlines were said to ride beneath banners made from the pelts of enemy kings, letting their foes know exactly what fate awaited those who opposed the children of the meadows. The bone goblets were perhaps the most notorious of their customs, vessels carved from the heads of defeated champions and lined with gold for use in the most hallowed ceremonies. To drink from such a cup was to partake of the fallen hero's essence, to gain access to his memories and skills. The greatest leaders possessed collections of these macabre treasures, each one a story written in bone and metal, a testament to victories won and enemies overcome. For all their fearsome reputation in warfare, the mounted tribes possessed a spiritual life of extraordinary complexity and depth. They worshipped not in temples of stone and timber, but in hallowed groves where the wind sang through ancient trees, at springs where the earth's essence bubbled up from unknown depths, and on hilltops where the endless dome of heaven pressed close enough to touch. At the apex of their pantheon stood Tabiti, the great goddess who ruled over hearth and home, whose eternal flame burned in the heartland of the royal territories. She was the mother of all warmth, the keeper of the fire that separated civilization from chaos, the divine presence that transformed a collection of wandering tribes into a true confederation. Her priestesses, known throughout the meadowlands for their wisdom and their terrible prophecies, maintained the fires that never died and spoke the words that bound oath-takers to their vows. Papaios the Sky Father ruled the realm above, lord of thunder and lightning, master of the storms that swept across the endless plains. His voice spoke in the crash of thunder and the howl of wind. His anger blazed in the lightning that could split a tree or strike down a rider. The mounted tribes called upon him before great conflicts, offering white steeds whose spirits would carry their prayers to the celestial courts. Api, the Earth Mother, governed the black soil that produced the grain and grass, the rivers that provided water for man and beast, the secret places where gold and iron slept in darkness. She was both nurturer and destroyer, giving life to all that grew while claiming the bodies of all who died. Her festivals, celebrated when the earth awakened from winter's sleep, involved ceremonial combats and mass offerings that painted the meadows red with the essence of life. But above all these deities stood a god without name or form, represented only by an ancient iron sword thrust into a mound of earth and brushwood. This was the Lord of War, the divine principle that turned peaceful herders into instruments of conquest, the hallowed force that flowed through every blade and bowstring. Before this crude altar, the mounted tribes made their most solemn vows and their most terrible offerings. The ceremony of the Iron Blade took place each year when the tribes gathered for the Great Assembly. 100 horses were led before the ancient weapon, their throats opened with golden knives while priests chanted in the old tongue. The crimson essence was allowed to soak into the earth around the altar, feeding the hungry deity who had made the riders masters of half the world. Then came the human offerings, captured enemies, criminals, sometimes volunteers who sought honor in the afterlife. Their end was quick but absolute, their spirits joining the eternal hunt that raged across the prairies of the dead. What came next, swearing oaths, locked the participants together with unbreakable bonds. Fighters who drank mixed life essence from the bone goblets became brothers in more than name, their lives forfeit if they betrayed the trust placed in them. Leaders who swore allegiance before the iron blade could not break their word without invoking curses that would follow them beyond the grave. The entire confederation was held together by these ethereal chains, invisible but unbreakable. Burial rites among the royal bloodlines revealed their belief in death as a passage, not a final stop. When a great leader died, his obsequies became an event that could last an entire year, drawing mourners from across the Confederation and beyond. The preparation began immediately, with embalmers using techniques learned from Egyptian masters to preserve the body, while the grave goods were gathered from the far corners of the Meadowland realm. At Chertomlik, where the earth rose in a great mound that could be seen from a day's ride away, future generations would discover the tomb of a king whose name had been forgotten, but whose treasures spoke of wealth beyond imagination. Golden vessels shaped like fantastic animals, silver plates decorated with scenes of riders in combat, bronze cauldrons large enough to cook for an army. All of these accompanied the deceased ruler on his journey to the hunting grounds of eternity. But the grave goods were only part of the interment ceremony. When the year of mourning ended and the time came to seal the tomb, the king's retinue prepared to follow him into the afterlife. His favorite wife, chosen from among many to share his eternal hunt, was given a golden cup filled with wine mixed with deadly herbs. His grooms and armor-bearers, his cupbearer and his bard, his bodyguards and his mystics, 50 souls in all, drank the poisoned wine and lay down beside their master, their loyalty extending beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. The entombment itself required the labor of thousands. Earth was piled high over the wooden tomb chamber, creating artificial hills that served as landmarks for generations of travelers. The mound at Soloka rose more than 60 feet above the surrounding meadows, while the tomb at Kuloba was crowned with a stone chamber lined with paintings that depicted the afterlife as an eternal feast, where heroes recounted their deeds while beautiful maidens served wine that never ran dry. Within these tombs, the deceased kings lay surrounded by the tools they would need in the afterlife. Armaments of iron and bronze, armor decorated with golden plates, the composite bows that had served them in life. All were arranged according to ancient custom. The horses that would carry them on their eternal hunts were interred nearby, sometimes dozens of them, their bodies arranged in perfect formation, as if ready to charge across the meadows of the dead. The golden animal style art that decorated these grave goods spoke a language understood throughout the Meadowland world. Deer with antlers that flowed like rivers of bronze, eagles whose wings spread wide enough to cast shadows over entire armies, wolves whose eyes burned with the fire of rubies. These were not mere decorations, but hallowed symbols that embodied the forces governing life and mortality. The deer represented the peaceful aspect of existence, the gentle grazing herds that provided sustenance for the tribes. But the artists depicted them with supernatural antlers that curved and branched like growing trees, suggesting the connection between earthly life and cosmic forces. Panthers and lions, though unknown in the Meadowlands, appeared frequently in the art, symbols of royal authority borrowed from the civilized kingdoms, but transformed by nomad imagination into creatures of dream and legend. The eagle held special significance as the messenger between earth and heaven, the creature that could soar higher than any earthly being and look down upon the works of mortals and immortals alike. Eagle-headed griffins combined this celestial nature with the ferocity of earthbound predators, becoming symbols of divine kingship that appeared on the most precious objects found in royal tombs. But perhaps the most intriguing figures were the human forms that appeared in many of the artistic compositions: bearded fighters engaged in combat, mystics performing ceremonies, females whose elaborate headdresses marked them as priestesses or queens. These figures, rendered with remarkable skill and attention to detail, provided glimpses into the daily life and beliefs of a people who left no written records but spoke eloquently through their art. The role of females in this society was more complex than foreign observers often realized. While the mounted tribes were indeed a patriarchal culture, where men held most of the formal authority, females could achieve remarkable status through otherworldly power or exceptional skill. The priestesses of Steppe wielded influence that reached into every aspect of tribal life, their words carrying the weight of divine command. Some females took the fighter's path, learning to ride and shoot as skillfully as their male counterparts. These battle maidens, whom the Greeks would remember as Amazons, formed elite units within some tribal armies, their ferocity in combat becoming legendary throughout the ancient world. Evidence from later excavations would reveal female interments accompanied by armaments and horse gear, proof that the stories of female fighters contained more truth than fiction. The mystics who served as intermediaries between the mortal world and the realm of spirits included both men and females. Though those of ambiguous gender, the Eneres mentioned in Greek sources held special reverence as beings who had transcended normal human limitations. These figures, neither fully male nor female, were believed to possess enhanced sight that allowed them to see truths hidden from ordinary mortals. The annual gathering at the eternal hearth of Steppe brought together representatives from across the Confederation for ceremonies that reinforced tribal unity while honoring the divine forces that guided their destiny. Here, beneath the eternal flame that had burned since the time of Coloxius, the riders renewed their oaths of loyalty and received the blessings that would sustain them through another year of wandering. The ceremonial smoking of hemp in felt-covered tents was both recreational and otherworldly, a way of achieving altered states of consciousness that allowed communication with the spirit world. The fighters would construct small shelters, seal themselves inside with burning hemp seeds, and emerge in states of ecstatic joy that sometimes lasted for days. These sessions often preceded important raids or tribal gatherings, serving to unite the participants in shared visions and common purpose. The brotherhood ceremonies that created bonds between fighters from different tribes involved the mixing of life essence in hallowed vessels, usually the bone goblets that had been carved from defeated enemies. The participants would make small cuts in their arms or hands, allowing their crimson essence to flow together while swearing oaths that made them closer than relatives. These artificial kinship ties helped maintain unity within the Confederation, despite the natural tendency of wandering peoples to fragment into smaller groups. The treatment of the deceased varied according to social status and the manner of their end. Common fighters were often exposed on wooden platforms where vultures and other scavengers could strip the flesh from their bones, a practice that reflected the belief that the spirits of the departed needed to be freed from their earthly shells before beginning their journey to the afterlife. The clean bones were then interred in simple graves marked with standing stones or wooden posts. Kings and great leaders, however, required more elaborate preparations. The year-long process of mummification and obsequial preparation was designed to preserve the body's integrity while gathering the goods and servants needed for the afterlife journey. The actual entombment involved the construction of wooden chambers deep beneath artificial mounds, creating underground palaces where the deceased rulers could hold court in the world beyond. The offering of retainers and animals at royal obsequies was not seen as cruel or wasteful, but as necessary provision for the afterlife journey. The fallen king would need servants in the next world just as he had in this one, and the volunteers who chose to accompany him gained honor that would be remembered for generations. Their names were carved in stone or sung in epic poems, ensuring that their dedication would not be forgotten. As the Confederation grew in wealth and influence, the scale of these displays increased dramatically. Later, royal interments would involve the offering of hundreds of horses and dozens of human attendants, creating necropolises that rivaled the pyramids of Egypt in their grandeur and complexity. The meadowlands themselves became a vast cemetery, where the mounds of the departed served as navigation points for the living, a landscape shaped by the ceremonies of mortality and remembrance. Through all these practices, the terror tactics that broke their enemies' will, the ceremonies that bound them to their deities, the elaborate obsequies that honored their greatest leaders, the riders created a culture that was both utterly pragmatic and deeply mystical. They understood that survival on the plains required both physical toughness and otherworldly guidance, that victory in combat depended as much on divine favor as on tactical skill. The world they created was harsh, but magnificent, a realm where honor mattered more than comfort and freedom more than security. In their golden art and their crimson ceremonies, in their mobile camps and their eternal mounds, they wrote the story of a people who had chosen the difficult path of constant movement over the easy comfort of settled life, who had made the endless meadowlands their temple and the storm-swept heavens their roof. Their legacy would echo through the ages, not just in the treasures interred beneath their mounds, but in the example they set of a life lived without compromise, where the demands of honor and the call of the horizon were worth any price. They had shown the world what it meant to be truly free, and that lesson would inspire wandering peoples for centuries to come. It was an empire's gamble. 700,000 men sent across a restless sea to break a land ruled only by storm. But the wild wouldn't yield. The King of Kings found no victory there, only the hard truth that some places resist by nature, that the open world teaches what cities forget, and that real power sometimes looks like walking away. Along the northern shores of the Euxine Sea, where the great rivers pour their tribute into the wine-dark depths, a new kind of commerce had begun to flourish. The Hellenic colonies that dotted the coastline like pearls on a string had discovered that the wild horsemen of the interior possessed not only fearsome martial might, but also grain enough to feed distant city-states and gold enough to make merchants dream of retirement. What had begun as tentative trade between refined settlers and barbarian riders had grown into something approaching alliance. Olbia, greatest of these coastal settlements, stood where the mighty Borysthenes met the sea, its warehouses bulging with the wealth of two worlds. Here, Egyptian papyrus mingled with nomad furs, Athenian pottery with amber from the distant northern seas, wine from the sun-blessed islands with honey from the meadowlands. The harbour bristled with merchant vessels from a dozen different lands, their holds stuffed with goods that would command premium prices in markets from the Pillars of Hercules to the Golden Horn. But the most precious cargo flowing through these ports was not exotic goods, but the staff of life itself. The Black Earth country produced grain in quantities that amazed even the Hellenes, those master farmers who had taught half the Mediterranean world how to coax wheat from reluctant soil. Shipload after shipload of barley and millet sailed southward to feed the growing populations of Athens and Corinth, creating a lifeline of commerce that bound the mounted confederation to the wider world of the inland sea. The profits from this trade transformed both societies in ways that neither fully understood. Hellenic artisans learned to work in the animal styles favored by their barbarian customers, creating masterpieces that combined southern technical skill with northern spiritual vision. Royal bloodlines acquired tastes for luxuries their ancestors had never imagined. Fine wines aged in buried amphorae, olive oil pressed from trees that grew where winter never came, textiles woven with threads of gold and silver. More profound was the exchange that accompanied the flow of goods. Hellenic craftsmen established workshops in the coastal settlements, creating objects that told the story of rider life in bronze and precious metals. Vases depicted mounted archers in full gallop, their composite bows drawn to shoot backward at pursuing enemies. Golden plaques showed scenes of camp life, horsemen tending their mounts, shamans performing sacred rites, fighters sharing the fermented mare's milk that was their ancestral drink. Some among the royal bloodlines went further in their embrace of southern ways. Scythians, son of a nomad king and a Hellenic mother, established a palace in Olbia, where he lived like a Mediterranean prince, complete with servants trained in the refinements of refined life. He built temples to Hellenic gods, participated in their mysteries, and even took a southern wife whose sophistication dazzled visitors from the northern plains. But this mingling came at a price that would ultimately prove too high for the mounted spirit to bear. The very qualities that made the horsemen masters of the plains, their mobility, their independence, their fierce egalitarianism, began to erode under the influence of southern luxury. Young nobles who should have been learning to read the weather and manage vast herds spent their time instead in wine shops and theatres, acquiring soft hands and softer spirits. The crisis came when Scythians attempted to be initiated into the mysteries of Dionysus, that wine god whose ecstatic worship seemed to offer a refined equivalent to the shamanic customs of the plains. But when word of this sacrilege reached the Confederation, the reaction was swift and terrible. The monarch who would abandon the gods of his fathers for foreign deities had forfeited his right to rule. His own brother, Octamassadas, led the faction that deposed him, and Scythians met the fate of all traitors, his head separated from his shoulders by the bronze blade of ancestral justice. Anyone paying attention could see the message plain as day. The horsemen could trade with the refined world, could learn from it and profit by it, but they could not become part of it without ceasing to be themselves. The plains demanded its own kind of ruler, one who understood that true wealth lay not in golden vessels, but in the loyalty of mounted fighters, not in marble palaces, but in the liberty to follow the wind wherever it might blow. Yet even as this internal crisis played out, a far greater threat was gathering beyond the southern mountains. The first of that name among the Achaemenids, ruler of an empire that stretched from the sunrise to the setting sun, had turned his attention northward to the one region that remained outside his dominion. The reports his spies brought back spoke of vast wealth flowing through the coastal settlements, of a people who controlled trade routes linking his empire to the Amber Lands, of horsemen whose prowess might serve his purposes if properly harnessed. The Achaemenid monarch had subdued Egypt and Babylon, had made Lydia and the Hellenic settlements of Asia Minor into provinces of his empire. Wherever his forces marched, local rulers had a choice: submit and keep their thrones as vassals, or resist and face destruction. It seemed inconceivable that a collection of mounted tribes, however fierce, could stand against the machinery that had brought the refined world to its knees. But the great sovereign had never faced enemies like the children of the wind. His previous victories had involved taking settlements, defeating forces that fought in conventional formations, negotiating with rulers who governed from fixed capitals. The plains offered none of these familiar targets. Here was a realm without walls to breach, forces that refused to stand and fight, leaders who could pack their entire kingdom onto wagons and disappear into vastness too immense for any earthly power to patrol. The Achaemenid preparations for the northern expedition were on a scale that dwarfed even the invasion of Egypt. 700,000 men, according to the scribes who recorded such things, though numbers become meaningless when applied to forces too vast for mortal comprehension. Infantry from every corner of the empire, Achaemenids and Medes, Assyrians and Babylonians, Egyptians and Phoenicians, Indians and Ethiopians, a host that spoke 50 languages and worshipped 100 gods, but marched under a single banner. Even the Achaemenid talent for order was pushed to its limits by the task of moving such a massive force. Supply trains stretched across entire provinces, each regional governor tasked with providing specified quantities of grain, oil, wine, and fodder. Engineers worked for months preparing the route, building bridges across rivers that had never known the weight of legions, constructing roads through wilderness that had known only the tracks of wild beasts. The crossing of the Bosphorus became a marvel that poets would sing for generations. Mandrocles of Samos, greatest of engineers, threw a bridge of boats across the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia, creating a pathway for the greatest host the world had ever seen. Ship after ship was lashed together with cables thick as a man's waist, planked over with timbers cut from the forests of Bithynia, guarded by towers that bristled with archers and catapult crews. But even more impressive was the bridging of the Danube, that great river which the Hellenes called Ister, and which marked the boundary between the refined world and the realm of the riders. Here the sovereign ordered the construction of a permanent crossing, 60 ships bound together to support a roadway wide enough for his entire host to pass. The work took months, but when it was finished, the Achaemenid forces could advance and withdraw at will, maintaining their vital connection to the empire's heartland. As news of these preparations filtered northward through the network of traders and spies that connected the Hellenic settlements to their barbarian neighbors, the mounted confederation faced the greatest crisis in its history. For the first time since their ancestors had driven out the Cimmerians, they confronted an enemy whose resources seemed infinite, whose determination appeared unshakable, whose previous victories suggested that resistance was futile. Strategy talks dragged on for months, fueled by clashing views within the royal court. Some advocated immediate submission, arguing that the Achaemenids sought trade and tribute rather than domination, that accommodation was preferable to annihilation. Others called for a fighting withdrawal to the eastern plains, abandoning the rich lands along the coast to preserve the core of their confederation. Still others demanded a conventional battle, trusting in their superior cavalry to break the Achaemenid host as they had broken so many enemies before. But Edanthersus the Far-Seer, greatest of the royal bloodline's leaders, understood that this enemy required tactics as unprecedented as the threat itself. The Achaemenids expected to fight a conventional struggle against a conventional enemy. They had prepared for sieges and pitched battles, for negotiations with frightened rulers, and ceremonies of submission in conquered capitals. Instead, they would find something entirely different. An enemy that refused to play by the accepted rules of combat, that treated the vastness of the plains itself as their supreme weapon. What the councils finally agreed on would have struck a seasoned commander as completely unhinged. The horsemen would not withdraw. Withdrawal implied that they had somewhere to go, some final stronghold where they could make their stand. Instead, they would advance, but in a direction their enemies could not follow. They would lead the Achaemenid host deeper and deeper into the plains, stretching their supply lines until they snapped, wearing down their strength through constant harassment, teaching them the bitter lesson that some victories cost more than any defeat. When the sovereign finally crossed the Danube with his unprecedented host, he found a land that seemed to mock his very presence. The Hellenic settlements opened their gates without resistance, their leaders offering tribute and supplies, while carefully avoiding any commitments that might prove dangerous if the wind changed. But beyond the coastal territories lay only emptiness. Vast meadowlands that rolled away toward horizons too distant to comprehend, broken by the occasional burial mound or abandoned campsite, but showing no sign of the great confederation that supposedly ruled these lands. The Achaemenid monarch had expected to find legions drawn up for battle, settlements prepared for siege, some recognizable enemy against which his overwhelming force could be brought to bear. Instead, his scouts reported only emptiness, grazing herds without herders, cold campsites, tracks that led nowhere and everywhere at once. It was as if the entire population of the plains had simply vanished, leaving behind a land as empty as the surface of the moon. But Idanthersus had not vanished. He had simply refused to provide the kind of target Achaemenid tactics required. The mounted forces moved like schools of fish or flocks of birds, never presenting a formation large enough to be worth attacking, but never allowing the invaders a moment's peace. When Achaemenid detachments moved out to forage, they found mounted archers waiting in ambush. When the main host tried to advance, it discovered that wells had been poisoned, bridges destroyed, every source of supply eliminated. It wasn't about winning a battle, it was about wearing them out, one sleepless night and skirmish at a time. A cavalry patrol would be found dead around a dried well, killed by arrows that seemed to have come from nowhere. A supply train would be attacked at dawn by riders who vanished before guards could respond. Messengers sent to the coastal settlements would disappear without trace, their fate unknown but easily imagined. Most maddening of all were the gifts that began arriving after weeks of this fruitless pursuit. The sovereign would wake to find a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows laid out before his tent, tokens whose meaning escaped even his wisest advisors, but which clearly represented some form of barbarian mockery. The message, when it was finally decoded, was as insulting as it was clear. Unless the Achaemenids could fly like birds, burrow like mice, or hide in marshes like frogs, they would be shot full of arrows like hedgehogs. The psychological pressure was as effective as the physical attacks. Achaemenid soldiers who had subdued half the world found themselves jumping at shadows, seeing enemies in every distant rider, hearing the whistle of arrows in every gust of wind. The vast host that had seemed invincible when it crossed the Danube began to show signs of the strain that came from fighting an enemy that refused to be pinned down or brought to decisive engagement. Idanthersus himself appeared only once during the entire expedition, riding close enough to the Achaemenid camp to deliver his response to demands for submission. His words carried the cold contempt of a free man addressing a slave. "Foolish sovereign, I have never fled from any man in fear, nor do I flee from you now. I am not doing anything new compared to what I do in peacetime. I will tell you why I do not fight you immediately. We have no settlements or cultivated land to fear for. lest they be captured or ravaged, which might make us rush to battle with you. But if you must come to blows with us quickly, we have the graves of our fathers. Find these and try to destroy them, and you will know whether we will fight you or not." It was a battle of ideas, as much as it was a clash of arms. The Achaemenid sovereign ruled an empire of settlements and cultivated fields, territories that could be seized, and populations that could be enslaved. But the horsemen had made liberty itself their only possession, the open plains their only stronghold. How could an empire capture that which recognized no boundaries? How could forces defeat enemies whose only fortress was the wind itself? As summer turned toward autumn and the first cold winds began to blow across the meadowlands, the sovereign faced a choice that would define his reputation for all time. He could continue the pursuit deeper into the plains, following an enemy that led him ever further from his supplies and closer to the killing cold of the northern winter. Or he could admit defeat and withdraw, returning to his empire with the bitter knowledge that somewhere in the world lay a people his mighty forces could not subdue. When the retreat came, it was carried out with the same precision that had marked the unstoppable advance. Achaemenid engineers had prepared for this possibility, maintaining the Danube bridge and keeping the supply lines open despite constant harassment. But the pullback could not disguise the fundamental truth that the greatest host the world had ever seen had been defeated not by superior force, but by superior strategy, not by the courage of barbarian fighters, but by the wisdom of barbarian leaders. The victory belonged not to any single battle or brilliant maneuver, but to the deeper understanding that some things cannot be subdued because they refuse to be possessed. The horsemen had shown the world that liberty was not a luxury to be traded for security, but a principle worth any sacrifice, a way of life that could not be compromised without being destroyed. When the last Achaemenid soldier disappeared beyond the southern horizon, the riders emerged from the depths of the plains like grass sprouting after rain. Their herds, hidden in valleys too distant for enemy scouts to find, returned to the familiar grazing grounds. Their families, scattered across half a continent to keep them safe, came together for celebrations that lasted from new moon to full. But the victory came at a price that would shape the Confederation's future in ways its leaders could not foresee. The expedition had required cooperation between tribes that had been feuding for generations, unity of command that overrode traditional independence, sacrifice of local interests for the common good. In defeating the Achaemenids, the horsemen had learned to act like an empire themselves, and that knowledge would prove both blessing and curse in the years to come. Hellenic settlements that had hedged their bets during the invasion now rushed to renew their alliances with the victorious barbarians. Commerce resumed on a scale larger than ever before, as word spread throughout the Mediterranean world that the northern lands were rich beyond imagination and ruled by fighters who had humbled the King of Kings himself. Gold flowed northward to buy grain and furs, while ships carried amber and honey to markets in Athens and Alexandria. But beneath the surface prosperity, deeper changes were taking place that would ultimately transform the Confederation as profoundly as any defeat. The contact with Achaemenid society, brief though it had been, had exposed the mounted leadership to new ideas about government and combat, trade and diplomacy. Some of these innovations would strengthen the Confederation, but others would gradually erode the very qualities that had made victory possible. The plains had taught the King of Kings a lesson in humility, but they had also learned something from him in return. The age of pure mobility was ending, replaced by something more complex and ultimately more fragile. The horsemen had won their greatest victory, but in winning it, They had begun the slow transformation that would eventually lead to their decline. The children of the wind had tasted the bitter fruit of empire, and like all who sup at that table, they would find it increasingly difficult to remember the simpler satisfactions of liberty. The fall of the horse lords began when their power peaked. They were driven west by new rivals from the east, just as ruthless. One by one, they fell, until their greatest leader died fighting a Macedonian prince far from his homeland. In the generations that followed the great victory over the Achaemenid host, the mounted alliance that had humbled the King of Kings began to show the subtle signs of transformation that mark the difference between a people born to the saddle and those who have learned to value comfort over liberty. The bloodlines of nobility, enriched by tribute from grateful Hellenic colonies and trade with distant kingdoms, began to build permanent settlements along the great rivers, places where treasures could be stored and craftsmen could work in safety from the constant movement that had once defined their existence. These were not urban centers in the sense that southern peoples understood them, but they represented a fundamental shift in the mounted spirit. Kamenskoye, rising beside the Dnieper, where the river bends toward the sea, became a center where bronze workers and goldsmiths created treasures that rivaled anything produced in the workshops of Athens or Babylon. Belsk, sprawling across the meadowlands like a permanent camp grown too large for its boundaries, served as a gathering place where clan councils could meet without the constant need to move with the seasons. The very success of these innovations carried within it the poison that would eventually weaken the alliance's martial spirit. Young nobles who should have been learning to read weather signs and manage vast herds instead spent their time in workshops, acquiring skills that tied them to fixed locations. The composite bow, supreme weapon of the mounted archer, began to seem less important than the bronze working techniques that could create objects of beauty and trade value. The steed, partner and companion of the true rider, gradually became merely a means of transportation between settlements rather than the other half of a fighter's soul. But while the established bloodlines grew soft with prosperity, far to the east, new clans were learning the lessons that had made their western cousins masters of the world. Beyond the Tanais, in the vast plains that stretched toward the sunrise, the peoples bearing the name of their ancient homeland had been watching and learning, absorbing the tactical innovations that had defeated the greatest army the world had ever seen, while avoiding the compromises that had begun to weaken their teachers. These eastern kinsmen shared the same Iranian heritage as the established alliance, spoke dialects of the same ancient tongue, worshipped gods whose names echoed across the grasslands like distant thunder. But they had remained closer to the original ideal of mobility, their lives still organized around the rhythms of seasonal movement and the demands of the herds, their fighters still sleeping beneath the open sky rather than in permanent dwellings. First came the Roxolani, massing at the edge like a storm front moving in. Their name meant the Bright Ones, and they rode beneath banners that caught the morning light like captured fire. These were not raiders seeking quick plunder, but a people in motion, entire kinship groups moving westward with their families and herds, their wagons loaded with the accumulated wealth of generations spent mastering the sunrise plains. Behind them rode the Iazigis, whose prowess with lance and sword had made them feared throughout the lands beyond the Volga, where the Roxolani fought in the manner of mounted archers, striking from a distance and withdrawing before their enemies could respond. The Iazigis had developed new tactics that combined the mobility of mounted fighters with the shock impact of heavy cavalry. Their riders wore scales of iron and bronze, their mounts protected by armor that gleamed like the shells of supernatural beetles. Most formidable of all were the Aorsi, whose very name meant the Swift Ones, and whose reputation for speed and ferocity had spread from the Caspian shores to the Amber coasts. These were the wolves of the Sunrise Plains, lean and hungry peoples who had learned combat in the hardest school imaginable. The endless struggle for survival in lands where winter could kill as surely as any enemy's blade. The pressure they brought to bear was not the sudden shock of invasion, but the slow, inexorable push of peoples who needed new grazing lands for their herds and new domains for their growing populations. Each spring brought them a little further west. Each autumn found them a little more firmly established in regions that had belonged to the alliance for generations beyond counting. It was not domination in any conventional sense, but something more fundamental. The replacement of one people by another through the simple mechanism of demographic pressure. History closed in on the clans, leaving them nowhere to turn. To the south lay the civilized kingdoms with their fixed boundaries and settled populations, offering trade and partnership, but also the constant temptation to abandon the mounted life for the easier comforts of sedentary existence. To the east pressed their own kinsmen, hungrier and fiercer than they had become, demanding regions that the alliance could not yield without losing its identity as masters of the grassland. The first conflicts were small affairs, skirmishes between advance guards rather than engagements between nations. A Roxolani raiding party would strike at an established outpost, driving off horses and disappearing into the vastness of the plains before retaliation could be organized. Yazija's lancers would appear at the edge of ancestral grazing grounds, challenging the local chiefs to single combat with an arrogance that demanded response. Aozi mounted archers would test the boundaries, like wolves testing a flock, probing for weakness and retreating when strength was shown. But these minor encounters were merely the prelude to a greater crisis that would reshape the entire balance of influence across the steppes. The established alliance, grown prosperous through trade and enriched by tribute, had lost much of the lean hunger that had made their ancestors invincible. Their fighters rode well-fed steeds and carried weapons forged by master craftsmen, but they lacked the desperate edge that comes from knowing that failure means death, not just for themselves, but for their families and their way of life. In contrast, the new clans brought raw drive, the kind that comes from having nothing and wanting everything. They had learned the lessons of mounted warfare in the same school that had taught their Western cousins, but they had not yet been corrupted by success. Their steeds were tougher, their riders harder, their chiefs more willing to take the risks that victory demanded. The decisive moment came when Atius the last, greatest champion king of the bloodlines of nobility, decided that the time had come to settle accounts with these upstart kinsmen once and for all. In the 40th year of his reign, when his hair had turned white as winter snow, but his arm remained strong enough to draw the ancient bow of his ancestors, he gathered the full might of the alliance for what would prove to be its final great expedition. The host that assembled at his call was magnificent beyond description. 50,000 riders, drawn from every clan between the Danube and the Tanais, their armor gleaming like a sea of bronze and iron beneath the endless sky. Here rode the descendants of the fighters who had humbled Darius, the inheritors of customs that stretched back to the days when Colaxius first claimed the golden gifts of heaven. Their banners bore the images of the sacred animals, deer and eagle, wolf and griffin, while their weapons sang with the accumulated might of generations of victory. But even as the old sovereign marshaled his forces for the Sunrise expedition, a new threat was emerging from an unexpected direction. The Macedonian, father of the boy who would one day conquer the world, had been watching the northern regions with the calculating eye of a predator sensing opportunity. The Macedonian kingdom, small but growing in authority and ambition, had learned much from its conflicts with the Thracian clans, who served as intermediaries between the civilized south and the mounted north. Unlike others, the southern monarch knew it wasn't numbers that mattered, but coordination over distance. If that coordination could be broken, if the clans could be divided against themselves or distracted by multiple threats, then even the greatest mounted force could be overcome by a smaller but more disciplined army. The Macedonian strategy was as brilliant as it was ruthless. Instead of challenging the alliance directly, he began to foment discord among the Thracian peoples who served as a buffer between his kingdom and the mounted domains. Clans that had paid tribute to the horse lords for generations were encouraged to rebel, offered Macedonian gold and promises of protection if they would break their ancient oaths of submission. The rebellion spread like wildfire through the western borderlands, drawing the old king and his fighters away from their planned expedition against the Sunrise peoples. Every day spent suppressing Thracian revolts was a day that the newcomers could use to consolidate their hold on formerly allied regions. Every fighter committed to the western frontier was one less rider available for the defense of the heartland. He faced pressure from both sides, Eastern armies on one front, Macedonians scheming on the other. His forces, formidable though they were, could not be in two places at once. The choice he faced was bitter but unavoidable. Abandon the Sunrise domains to their fate and concentrate on protecting the western borderlands, or risk everything on a single great engagement that might decide the alliance's future once and for all. He went with glory, not caution, whatever the cost. Leaving a skeleton force to hold the Sunrise passes, he turned his full attention to the Macedonian threat, determined to crush the southern monarch's ambitions before they could grow into something truly dangerous. The decision would prove to be his last mistake, though perhaps also his greatest moment as a champion and a ruler. They met in battle in the autumn of the year 339 before Christ, on a field whose exact location has been lost to history, but whose consequences echo through the ages. The Macedonian commanded perhaps 20,000 men, phalangites with their long spears, Thracian cavalry whose tactics mimicked those of their mounted neighbors, Hellenic mercenaries whose discipline had been tested in a dozen different wars. Against them rode the old sovereign with 30,000 of the finest mounted fighters the world had ever seen, men whose grandfathers had laughed at the armies of Darius and whose fathers had raided as far south as the walls of Byzantium. The odds seemed heavily in favor of the riders, but numbers meant little when the tactical situation favored the more disciplined force. The Macedonian had chosen his ground with the eye of a master strategist, drawing the alliance forces into terrain that negated their greatest advantage, the ability to maneuver freely across open ground. Hills and ravines channeled the mounted charge into killing zones where Macedonian spears waited in hedgehog formations, while hidden reserves of cavalry struck at the flanks of enemy formations that had committed themselves too deeply to the attack. From sunrise to sunset, it was chaos, bronze clashing, horses screaming, men holding their ground. 3 times the alliance cavalry broke through the Macedonian lines, only to find themselves trapped in cul-de-sacs where their mobility became a liability rather than an asset. 3 times the southern reserves counterattacked, driving the riders back with losses that could not be replaced from the dwindling reserves. In the final charge, when the sun hung low in the western sky, like a bronze shield dented by combat, the old king himself led his personal guard against the Macedonian center. The aged sovereign rode like a man half his years, his ancient sword singing as it clove through enemy ranks, his war cry echoing across the field, like the voice of the plains themselves calling their children home. But even the greatest champion cannot fight destiny itself. A Macedonian spear, thrust by a soldier whose name history has forgotten, found the gap between the sovereign's helmet and his scale mail gorget. The last great king fell from his steed like a star falling from heaven, his blood darkening the earth that had known the hoofbeats of his ancestors for 1,000 years. With their monarch's death, the alliance's resistance crumbled like a dam breaking under floodwaters. The survivors scattered to the four winds, some fleeing eastward toward regions that might already be occupied by the Sunrise peoples, others seeking refuge among the Hellenic colonies that had once paid them tribute, but might now offer sanctuary to the vanquished. The Macedonian victory was complete, but like many complete victories, it contained within itself the seeds of future troubles. The destruction of the old king and his fighters removed the last effective barrier between the civilized south and the hungry clans of the Sunrise Plains. Within a generation, the new peoples would be pressing against the borders of Macedon itself, and the southern monarch's son would face mounted enemies far more numerous and desperate than any his father had encountered. But that was a problem for the future. For now, the Macedonian could content himself with the knowledge that he had broken the authority that had dominated the northern world for 3 centuries. The treasures of the fallen sovereign, golden vessels and bronze weapons, silk tapestries and amber ornaments, were loaded onto wagons and sent south to adorn Macedonian palaces, while the king's body was left for the ravens that had grown fat on the fruits of his ambition. The news of the disaster spread across the steppes faster than the autumn wind, carried by survivors who rode their exhausted steeds to the breaking point in their haste to warn the scattered clans of what had befallen their greatest champion. In a single day, the alliance had lost not just its most capable ruler, but its faith in its own invincibility, the psychological advantage that had made it possible for relatively small numbers of riders to dominate vastly larger settled populations. With the old king gone, they saw their chance and moved fast. The Roxolani crossed the Tanais in force, establishing permanent camps in regions that had belonged to the alliance since the days of Colaxaias. The Iazyges struck deep into the heartland, their heavy cavalry proving devastatingly effective against defenders whose morale had been shattered by the Macedonian disaster. The Aorsi, swiftest and most opportunistic of the newcomers, swept around the flanks of organized opposition to claim the richest grazing lands for themselves. Within a decade of the sovereign's death, the great alliance that had once ruled from the Danube to the Caspian had been reduced to a collection of minor chieftains squabbling over the remaining domains along the western rivers. The bloodlines of nobility maintained their ancient claims and their sacred ceremonies, but their authority extended little further than their immediate followers could ride in a single day. Some of the displaced clans sought accommodation with their kinsmen from the Sunrise, offering submission in exchange for junior partnership in the new order that was emerging across the steppes. Others withdrew entirely from the mounted life, settling in the proto-urban centers that had grown up along the trade routes and gradually transforming themselves from mounted fighters into farmers and craftsmen. A few proud remnants refused to accept submission, maintaining the old ways in increasingly marginal regions where the grass grew thin and the winters bit deep. These diehards preserved the ancient customs, the sacred sword ceremonies, the annual gatherings, the elaborate burial rites that sent dead chiefs to the eternal hunting grounds with all the honors due to fallen heroes. But they were ghosts of a vanished greatness, shadows of riders who had once made the earth tremble beneath their steeds' hooves. The world had changed in ways that made the old mounted empire impossible to sustain, The Hellenic colonies, no longer needing protection from an alliance that could barely protect itself, began to assert their independence and look to more reliable partners for their security needs. The trade routes that had once funneled wealth northward to mounted treasuries now flowed toward the sunrise domains or the emerging kingdoms of the south. Most cruelly of all, the climate itself seemed to turn against the descendants of the horse lords. The long period of warm, wet weather that had made the steppes a paradise for pastoralists was giving way to colder, drier conditions that reduced the carrying capacity of the grasslands. Herds that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands dwindled to mere thousands, while the human populations they supported faced the choice between relocation and starvation. The Celtic movements from the west added another element of chaos to an already unstable situation. These were not mounted peoples in the steppe manner, but settled clans displaced by Roman expansion, seeking new lands where they could rebuild their shattered communities. Their arrival in the western borderlands created a three-way struggle for domains between the remnants of the alliance, the advancing sunrise peoples, and the Celtic newcomers. A conflict that further fragmented what remained of mounted coordination. By the beginning of the second before Christ, the Great Alliance had ceased to exist as a unified political entity. The name continued to be used by southern writers, but it referred now to a geographical region rather than a coherent people. The lands beyond the civilized world where various barbarian clans pursued their incomprehensible feuds and partnerships. Even in submission and dissolution, the children of the wind had left their mark upon the world, in ways that could not be erased by military disaster or demographic displacement. The sunrise conquerors adopted many of their customs and techniques, while the Hellenic colonies preserved their art and their stories in forms that would influence Mediterranean civilization for centuries to come. The great burial mounds that dotted the steppes from the Carpathians to the Urals stood as monuments to a vanished greatness, their golden treasures waiting beneath the earth for future generations to discover and marvel at. In these silent tombs lay the true victory of the Alliance, not in the domains they had ruled or the engagements they had won, but in the example they had set of a people who had chosen liberty over security, movement over stability, the endless horizon over the comfortable cage. It was the twilight of the horse lords, not yet the night. To the east, new peoples were learning the lessons that the steppes had always taught, that mobility was authority, that coordination was strength, that the children of the wind could humble any earthly kingdom if they had the courage to ride against the storm. The future belonged to others now, but the dream of the horse lords would never entirely die. Sing, O Muse, of the final act in this ancient drama, when the descendants of the Wind Riders found themselves pressed into the far corners of their ancestral realm, holding fast to the old ways even as the world transformed around them. Tell how the children of the endless plains learned to build walls of stone, how they made alliance with the eagle-bearers of the south, and how they fought their last engagements not as lords of the grassland, but as guardians of a single peninsula jutting into the wine-dark sea. In the peninsula of Taurisha, where the mountains rise like broken teeth from the northern shores of the Euxine, the remnants of the once mighty confederation found their final refuge. Here, in this land of vineyards and wheat fields, of Hellenic temples and barbarian burial mounds, the last inheritors of Colaxius built their capital not of felt and timber, but of dressed stone and fired brick. Neapolis, they called it, the new settlement. Though it bore little resemblance to the mobile camps that had once been the seats of their ancestors' authority. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the old stories. A people who had once boasted that their only fortress was the open sky, now sheltered behind walls like any collection of farmers fearing raiders from the hills. The horse lords who had humbled Darius and laughed at the might of empires now counted their strength in the number of fighters they could muster for the defense of a single settlement, their wealth in the tribute they could extract from a handful of coastal communities. Yet even in this reduced state, something of the ancient fire still burned in the blood of those who claimed descent from the Skyborn. Scilurus the Stern ruled from his palace in Neapolis, with the authority of monarchs whose dominion had once stretched from the Amber Shores to the Caspian steppes. His court retained the ceremonies that had bound the scattered clans together in the days of their greatness. The sacred blade still received its annual offering of crimson essence. The golden vessels still caught the light of the eternal flame. The shamanic rituals still sent fighters into combat, convinced of their divine protection. But the world beyond the Tauric Peninsula had moved on, leaving the descendants of the riders stranded like seafarers on an island, while the tide of history flowed around them. To the east, the Sarmatian peoples had consolidated their hold on the ancestral meadowlands, transforming themselves from raiders into governors, from nomads into the masters of a new order that stretched from the Tanais to the Carpathian foothills. To the south, the eagles of the Tiber cast their shadow ever further northward, bringing with them a vision of law and order that left little room for the anarchic liberty of the steppes. The collision between these expanding forces was inevitable, but it would be played out on a stage far smaller than the vast theatres where their ancestors had performed their greatest dramas. The peninsula, rich in grain and strategically positioned at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, became a prize that multiple powers coveted but none could easily claim. The Bosporan realm, that curious hybrid of Hellenic civilization and barbarian energy that controlled the eastern shores of the peninsula, found itself caught between the hammer of southern ambition and the anvil of Sarmatian expansion. For generations, the Bosporans had played a delicate game, paying tribute to whichever authority seemed strongest while maintaining their independence through a combination of diplomatic skill and military capability. But by the 1st century before Christ, this careful balance was becoming impossible to maintain. The Latins, under their great general Pompey, had established their dominion over much of Asia Minor, and were casting covetous eyes toward the grain-rich lands of the northern shores. The Sarmatians, flush with their victories over the scattered remnants of the old confederation, pressed westward with increasing boldness, their heavy cavalry probing the defenses of Hellenic communities that had known peace for generations. Into this volatile situation stepped Scilurus, determined to prove that the blood of the horse lords still ran hot in the veins of his people. The peninsular monarch had studied the examples of his predecessors, learning from both their victories and their defeats. He understood that the age of pure nomadic conflict was over, that survival in the new world required adaptation to new methods of fighting and new forms of organization. The force he assembled was unlike anything his ancestors would have recognized. The core remained mounted archers in the traditional style, men who could still shoot with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, whose mobility remained their supreme advantage in broken terrain. But around this nucleus, Scilurus built formations of heavy infantry, armed and trained in the Sarmatian manner, shock troops who could hold ground against the best that the Tiber or her allies could field. More revolutionary still was his embrace of positional combat, that most unnomadic of military arts. The monarch imported engineers from the Hellenic settlements, masters of the stone thrower and the battering ram, who could teach his fighters how to take fortified positions rather than simply raiding the countryside around them. the descendants of men who had scorned walls as the refuges of cowards, learned to build and assault fortifications with the same skill their fathers had shown in reading the weather or managing herds. The test of these innovations came when Scilurus launched his great offensive against the Bosporan territories in the winter of 110 years before Christ. The expedition was planned with a thoroughness that would have impressed southern strategists, taking advantage of the seasonal patterns that the monarch's nomadic heritage had taught him to read. While his foes huddled in their winter quarters, confident that the harsh season would protect them from barbarian raids, the peninsular forces struck with devastating effect. The investment of Pantikapaeum, greatest settlement of the Bosporan realm, became the masterpiece of this new style of conflict. For 6 months, the descendants of the horse lords pressed their attack with relentless determination, their stone throwers hurling projectiles that shattered ancient walls, while their miners dug tunnels beneath the foundations of towers that had stood since the days of Alexander. When the settlement finally fell, its capture sent shockwaves throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Here was proof that the barbarian peoples of the north had learned to fight like civilized nations, that they could no longer be dismissed as mere raiders incapable of sustained military effort. Latin merchants who had grown rich on the grain trade began to pressure their government for action, while Hellenic intellectuals wrote learned treatises about the cyclical nature of history and the inevitable rise and fall of peoples and cultures. The success at Pantikapaeum brought Scilurus to the attention of powers far greater than any Bosporan ruler. In the palace of Mithridates, the sixth monarch of Pontus and self-proclaimed champion of the eastern peoples against Latin expansion, the peninsular victory was seen as an opportunity to open a new front in the great struggle between East and West that was reshaping the ancient world. The Pontic alliance that emerged from these calculations would prove to be both the greatest triumph and the ultimate downfall of the peninsular realm. Mithridates offered gold, armaments, and military advisors in exchange for Scilurus's commitment to harass Latin allies and disrupt the grain shipments that fed the growing population of the eternal metropolis. For the peninsular monarch, the partnership seemed to offer the chance to reclaim something approaching the old dominion, to lead his people back to greatness on the tide of a greater conflict. But Mithridates was a dangerous ally, a man whose ambitions knew no bounds and whose methods recognized no limits. The Pontic sovereign fought his wars with a savagery that shocked even hardened veterans, ordering massacres that left entire regions depopulated, and employing approaches that violated the unwritten laws governing conflict between civilized peoples. To be associated with such methods was to invite the undying enmity of the Tiber, a risk that proved far greater than any potential reward. The Latin response, when it came, was swift and merciless. Lucullus, that most methodical of generals, brought to the Eastern theatre the same systematic approach that had already crushed opposition in Asia Minor. But it was his successor, the great Pompey, who would deal the decisive blow to the dreams of peninsular independence. Pompey understood, as many Latin commanders did not, that the key to victory in the north lay not in pitched engagements, but in patient investment work and careful diplomacy. The scattered remnants of the old confederation might fight like demons when cornered, but they lacked the coordination and resources necessary for sustained opposition against an authority that could call upon the manpower and wealth of half the Mediterranean world. The expedition that followed was less a conflict than a methodical reduction of isolated strongholds, each defensive position falling in turn as Latin engineering skill proved superior to barbarian determination. The investment of Neapolis itself lasted only 3 months, though the defenders fought with a courage that won the grudging admiration of their foes. When the walls finally crumbled beneath the weight of Latin stone throwers, Scilurus himself led the last charge from the burning citadel, his ancient blade singing its final song before falling silent forever. Palacus survived the fall of the capital and attempted to continue the fight from mountain strongholds where Latin machines could not easily reach. For 3 years, he maintained a desperate opposition, using the mobility that remained his birthright to strike at Latin supply lines and then vanish into terrain too rough for conventional forces to follow. But guerrilla operations, however brilliantly conducted, could not restore a realm that had lost its economic base and its population centers. One by one, Palacus's supporters were hunted down or chose to make their peace with the conquerors. The last prince of the peninsular domain perished as his father had lived, blade in hand, facing impossible odds, refusing to the end the comfortable captivity that Latin clemency offered to defeated opponents. With the demise of Scilurus and his son, the political independence of the horse lord's descendants came to an end. But their story was far from over, for the Latins had learned to value the military skills that centuries of steppe conflict had bred into these peoples. Rather than attempting to exterminate or enslave the survivors, the pragmatic southerners offered them a different kind of future: service in the imperial forces as federati, allied troops who would fight under their own commanders in exchange for land, citizenship, and the right to maintain their ancestral customs. The transformation that followed was perhaps more profound than any military subjugation. Fighters who had learned to combat as free men in the service of their own monarchs now rode beneath the eagles of the Tiber, their traditional approaches adapted to serve the strategic needs of a world dominion. Their mobility made them invaluable as scouts and raiders, while their skill with the composite bow filled a gap in Latin military organization that conventional legions could not address. Some embraced this new role with enthusiasm, seeing in Southern service the chance to continue the combat tradition that had defined their people for a millennium. They rose through the ranks of the auxiliary forces, winning honors and decorations that their ancestors could never have imagined. A few even achieved positions of real authority within the imperial system, becoming prefects and tribunes whose advice was sought by governors and generals. Others found the transition more difficult, struggling to reconcile the demands of Latin discipline with the anarchic individualism that had been bred into them by generations of steppe life. These misfits often ended up in the frontier regions, serving in auxiliary units that patrolled the Dominion's most dangerous borders, their skills valued even as their reliability remained suspect. But perhaps the most significant development was the gradual integration of the surviving population with other displaced peoples. The Goths, pressing southward from the Baltic forests, found common ground with the descendants of the horse lords in their shared status as conquered nations within the Latin system. This cultural exchange saw Gothic metalworkers learn the secrets of animal style art, while absorbing Germanic techniques of ironworking. The arrival of the Huns in the 4th century, after Christ brought this stability to a violent end, these new nomads built their dominion through terror rather than the kinship bonds that had held the original confederation together. The peninsular population was either incorporated as foot soldiers or fled to remote regions, carrying the last remnants of ancient customs with them. What followed cleared away the last traces of the old order. Ostrogoths and Vandals, Alans and Bulgars passed through the peninsula in successive waves, each leaving traces while taking what seemed valuable, creating a complex cultural mixture. By the time the Byzantine state established its control over the northern shores of the Black Sea, The ancient name had become little more than a convenient label for any barbarian people who happened to live beyond the frontiers of civilization. Arab geographers used the term to describe Slavic communities along the Dnieper, while Byzantine chroniclers applied it to various Turkic peoples who controlled the trade routes between Constantinople and the Far East. Something deeper had survived the political extinction and transformation of the horse lord's descendants. In the folk memories of the peoples who inhabited the steppes, in the artistic motifs that appeared on metalwork and textiles, in the interment customs that persisted despite official conversion to Christianity, the ancient ways lived on in forms that would have been recognizable to the shamans of Colaxaias. The great mounds that dotted the landscape from the Danube to the Don remained as monuments to vanished greatness, their golden treasures slowly sinking deeper into the black earth, while the stories of those who lay beneath them transformed into legend and myth. Local peoples told tales of heroes who had ridden steeds that could fly, of monarchs whose arrows never missed their mark, of champions who had defeated the forces of distant sovereigns through cunning and courage. Some of these stories contained more truth than their tellers realized. Evidence would eventually reveal that the influence of the horse lords had spread far beyond the borders of their political dominion, that their artistic styles and military techniques had been adopted by peoples as distant as the Celtic communities of Western Europe and the nomadic confederations of Central Asia. The practice of mounted archery, refined to perfection in the meadowlands north of the Black Sea, would be carried westward by Germanic mercenaries and eastward by Hunnic conquerors, ultimately influencing military development from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The animal style art that had adorned the treasures of ancient monarchs would resurface in the metalwork of medieval Europe, while the epic poetry that celebrated their deeds would inspire the creation of new legends among peoples who had never seen the steppes. But perhaps their most enduring inheritance was the example they had provided of a different way of organizing human society. In an age when most peoples were learning to accept the authority of centralized states and urban civilizations, the horse lords had shown that it was possible to create complex political structures without sacrificing individual liberty or mobility. Their confederation had been held together not by law or bureaucracy, but by shared heritage and mutual respect, proving that human beings could cooperate on a vast scale without surrendering their autonomy to distant authorities. Rising numbers and modern weapons broke what once worked, but the memory of that failure and of the glorious centuries that had preceded it would continue to inspire peoples and individuals who found themselves trapped within systems that offered security at the price of submission. The horse lords had written their names not in stone or bronze, but in the wind itself, leaving behind an inheritance that could not be measured in conquered territories or accumulated treasures, but only in the dreams of liberty that their example had planted in the human imagination. They had shown the world what it meant to be truly free, and that lesson would outlive all the empires that had risen to replace them. When the last prince fell defending his mountain stronghold, and the final standard of the royal bloodlines was trampled in the dust of forgotten battlefields, those who watched from distant lands might have believed that the age of the riders had ended forever. The great confederation that had humbled Persian monarchs and laughed at the might of empires seemed to have vanished like morning mist before the rising sun, leaving behind only burial mounds and golden treasures to mark where once a free people had made the grassland itself their kingdom. Yet those who thought thus understood neither the nature of the plains, nor the character of those who had made them their home. The children of Colaxaias had never been a people in the manner that civilized men understood the term, bound to particular territories, defined by fixed boundaries, ruled by unchanging laws carved in stone. They had been something far more dangerous and far more enduring. An idea given form, a way of life that could survive the destruction of any particular tribe or confederation, because it lived not in settlements or institutions, but in the hearts and minds of those who carried the ancient knowledge. The Sarmatians, who claimed dominion over the western plains, were the first to discover that conquest and inheritance were not the same thing. These eastern kinsmen had defeated the royal bloodlines in combat and seized their grazing grounds, but in doing so, they found themselves compelled to adopt the very practices and techniques that had made their enemies so formidable. The composite bow that sang in Sarmatian hands was crafted according to patterns perfected in the workshops of the ancient masters. The golden vessels that caught the light in Sarmatian treasuries bore the same animal motifs that had adorned the cups of Ateas and Scilurus. More profound still was the adoption of the ancient ceremonies that bound ruler to ruled, that transformed a collection of competing tribes into a unified force capable of coordinated action across vast distances. The Roxolani learned to kindle the sacred fires that had burned in the heartland of the Royal Confederation. The Iazyges took up the practice of blood brotherhood that created bonds stronger than kinship between fighters from different clans. The Aorsi discovered that the shamanic rituals, which sent warriors into combat with divine protection, worked as well for them as they had for their predecessors. But it was not merely the practical aspects of mounted culture that proved irresistible to their conquerors. The philosophical dimensions of plains life, the understanding that true wealth lay in movement rather than accumulation, that genuine strength came from harmony with natural forces rather than domination over them. These too passed into the bloodstream of the peoples who followed. The Sarmatian chiefs who built their power on captured territories found themselves drawn inexorably toward the mounted ideal, abandoning their newly won settlements to follow the ancient patterns of seasonal movement. This process of inheritance extended far beyond the immediate borders of the former confederation. To the west, the Germanic peoples who had been pressing against the frontiers of the civilized world encountered refugees and exiles from the fallen kingdom. Fighters whose knowledge of mounted combat and plains tactics proved invaluable to tribes seeking to carve out new domains for themselves. The Goths, who would eventually sack Rome itself, learned much of their craft from veterans who had fled the Sarmatian advance, while the Vandals who terrorized North Africa carried with them techniques of rapid movement and harassment that bore the unmistakable stamp of plains origin. The animal style art that had reached such sublime heights in the workshops of the Royal Confederation proved equally adaptable to foreign hands and foreign purposes. Germanic metalworkers, studying the golden treasures that trickled westward through trade and plunder, discovered in the flowing lines and mythical creatures a visual language that spoke to something deep in their own creative heritage. The deer with antlers like growing trees, the eagles with wings spread wide as storms, the wolves whose eyes burned with supernatural fire. These images appeared on Germanic jewelry and weapons, transformed but recognizable, carrying forward into new contexts the insights of their creators. Even more remarkable was the adoption of plains interment practices by peoples who had never seen the endless grasslands. The great mound graves that dotted the landscape from the Carpathians to the Urals became the model for royal entombments among the Germanic tribes, though adapted to local conditions and beliefs. Frankish monarchs were interred with their mounts and armaments, in conscious imitation of practices that had originated among the riders, while Anglo-Saxon nobles carried into their graves golden artifacts, whose decorative motifs could be traced back to the workshops of the ancient confederation. The eastward flow of influence was equally profound. though perhaps less visible to eyes trained to observe only the dramatic movements of armies and the rise and fall of dynasties. The wandering peoples of the Central Asian plains, the Xiongnu, who pressed against the borders of Han China, the Yuezhi, who would eventually become the Kushans. These too learned from the example of the Western riders, adopting and adapting their techniques of political coordination and military organization. The great tribal confederations that would dominate the eastern meadowlands in later centuries all bore the marks of influence that could be traced back to the innovations of the mounted masters. The practice of dual leadership, with separate chiefs for conflict and peace, for the sacred and the secular, appeared among peoples who had never heard the names of Colaxais or Edanthusus, but who had inherited through intermediaries the principles that had made the Royal Confederation possible. Most enduring of all was the tactical revolution that the ancient riders had perfected and bequeathed to their successors. The combination of speed and firepower that had made their armies so formidable became the foundation upon which all subsequent plains combat was built. The Parthians, who humbled Roman legions at Carrhae, fought with bows and strategies that would have been familiar to the fighters who had harassed Darius across the grasslands. The Mongol armies that would eventually conquer half the world employed approaches of feigned retreat and coordinated movement that differed only in scale from those employed by Edanthusus against the Persian host. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the ancient inheritance was not military or artistic, but philosophical. The demonstration that human beings could organize themselves according to principles radically different from those that governed the civilized world, where settled peoples accepted hierarchy as natural and permanent. The children of the plains had created a society based on earned leadership and consensual power, where agricultural civilizations demanded conformity to fixed patterns of behavior. The mounted confederation had celebrated individual initiative and adaptive flexibility. This alternative vision of human possibility did not die with the fall of the last kingdom. It lived on in the stories that traveling merchants carried from market to market, in the songs that bards sang around campfires, in the half-remembered tales that grandmothers told to children who would never see the meadowlands, but who could still dream of riding free beneath an endless dome. The ancient riders had planted in the human imagination the idea that liberty was not merely the absence of constraint, but a positive force, a way of being in the world that brought its own rewards and demanded its own sacrifices. The Alans, those westernmost of the Sarmatian peoples, became perhaps the most faithful custodians of this vision, as they carried it across the breadth of Europe during the great movements of the 4th and 5th centuries. These riders, whose name would eventually survive in the modern Scythians of the Caucasus, maintained many of the ancient practices, even as they adapted to the changing circumstances of their wandering life. Their epic poetry preserved stories of champions who bore names that echoed across the centuries: Batraz and Soslan, Jamits and Akamaz, figures whose adventures recalled the deeds of the legendary monarchs, while speaking to the experiences of peoples far removed from the original homeland. When the Alans rode with the Vandals into Spain and Africa, they carried with them more than just their weapons and their mounts. They brought the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of plains life, the knowledge of how to maintain unity without surrendering diversity, how to preserve heritage while adapting to change, how to remain true to ancestral values while embracing new possibilities. The influence of this wisdom could be traced in the administrative methods of the Vandal realm, in the military structure of Alan's settlements, in the creative motifs that appeared on artifacts from Toulouse to Tangier. The Turkic peoples who emerged as the dominant force on the eastern meadowlands in the centuries following the fall of the Western Confederation inherited not just territories, but an entire conceptual framework for understanding the relationship between ruler and ruled, between the sacred and the secular, between the needs of the community and the rights of the individual. The great Turkic Khans, who would eventually establish empires stretching from the borders of China to the gates of Constantinople, organized their realms according to principles that would have been recognizable to the shamans of Colaxaias, even though the specific forms had evolved to meet new challenges and opportunities. The concept of the sacred kingship, in which the ruler served as intermediary between the earthly and celestial realms, passed from the ancient riders to their Turkic successors, and from them to peoples as distant as the Magyars, who settled in the Pannonian Basin, and the Bulgars, who established realms in the Balkans. The ancient understanding that political power must be balanced with otherworldly responsibility, that temporal dominion without divine sanction was tyranny rather than legitimate rule, continued to shape the expectations and aspirations of wandering peoples long after the original teachers had passed into legend. Even the settled civilizations that had once feared and despised the ancient riders eventually found themselves adopting elements of their inheritance. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome's eastern territories, discovered that the best way to defend their Danubian frontier was to employ federate troops whose approaches and structure bore the unmistakable stamp of plains origin. The Carolingian Empire that emerged in Western Europe relied heavily on heavy cavalry, whose equipment and methods had been influenced by contact with mounted heritage stretching back to the days of the Great Confederation. The Islamic expansion that swept across the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th and 8th centuries succeeded in part because the Arab armies had learned from earlier wandering conquerors how to combine speed with staying power, how to maintain the cohesion necessary for large-scale operations while preserving the flexibility that made rapid response possible. The riders who carried the banners of the Prophet from the Atlantic to the Indus employed strategic concepts that had been tested and refined in the grasslands north of the Black Sea centuries before Muhammad was born. But the most profound inheritance of the ancient riders was not tactical or administrative, but philosophical. The demonstration that human beings need not accept the limitations that circumstances seem to impose upon them, that with sufficient courage and imagination they could transform the very conditions of their existence. The children of sky and grass had shown that it was possible to create wealth without accumulating possessions, to build power without constructing hierarchies, to maintain order without sacrificing liberty. This vision of human possibility continued to inspire peoples and individuals who found themselves constrained by systems that demanded conformity in exchange for security. The Cossacks of the Ukrainian meadowlands, the gauchos of the South American pampas, the cowboys of the North American plains, all of these later riders carried within their ways echoes of the ancient understanding that true prosperity lay not in what one owned, but in what one could do, not in the safety of walls, but in the exhilaration of open distances. It endured quietly, changed beyond easy recognition. The flowing lines and fantastic creatures that had adorned the treasures of ancient monarchs reappeared in the illuminated manuscripts of medieval monasteries, in the stone carvings of Romanesque churches, in the metalwork of Renaissance craftsmen who had never heard of Colaxaias, but who responded intuitively to visual patterns that spoke to something fundamental in human aesthetic sensibility. The great narratives of later literature, the Nibelungenlied and the Song of Roland, the Arthurian romances and the Norse sagas, all bore traces of the storytelling heritage that had preserved the memory of the ancient riders' deeds. The figure of the champion sovereign who ruled through personal charisma, rather than institutional power. The ideal of the warband bound together by loyalty and honor rather than law and obligation. The celebration of movement and individual prowess over collective discipline and hierarchical order. These themes echoed through European literature for 1,000 years after the last banner had fallen. Perhaps most remarkably, the linguistic inheritance of the ancient riders survived in the very words that later peoples used to describe concepts that the Meadowlands had given to the world. The term paradise, which entered European languages through Persian and Greek, originally described the walled gardens of the Achaemenid sovereigns, but its ultimate root lay in an Iranian word that meant enclosure or protected space, a concept that the wandering ancestors of the Persians had understood as the opposite of their own ideal of unlimited liberty. The word had been transformed in meaning, but its journey from the plains to the settled world reflected the complex process by which mounted concepts were adapted to agricultural and urban contexts. Similarly, many of the technical terms associated with horsemanship and mounted combat could be traced back through multiple linguistic borrowings to origins in the Iranian dialects spoken by the ancient riders and their kinsmen. The very vocabulary that civilized peoples used to describe the innovations that had made their own armies effective preserved the memory of teachers whose names had been forgotten, but whose knowledge lived on in the words themselves. The religious inheritance was perhaps the most subtle, but also the most pervasive. The shamanic ways of the Meadowlands, with their emphasis on direct communion between human beings and the otherworldly forces that govern the world, influenced the development of mystical approaches throughout Eurasia. The understanding that the divine could be encountered in the natural world, that inner truth was accessible to individuals without the mediation of institutional hierarchies, that the sacred and the secular were aspects of a single reality rather than separate realms. These insights, refined and systematized by the shamans of the ancient riders, passed into the inner life of peoples as diverse as the Sufis of Central Asia and the Celtic Druids of Western Europe. The great religious syntheses of later centuries, Buddhism as it developed in the Silk Road kingdoms, Christianity as it spread among the Germanic tribes, Islam as it evolved in Central Asia, all showed traces of mounted influence, though often so thoroughly integrated that their plains origins were invisible to later observers. The emphasis on personal experience over doctrinal orthodoxy, the celebration of wandering teachers over settled institutions, the understanding of inner development as a journey rather than a destination. These themes reflected perspectives that had been shaped by centuries of wandering life. In the end, the inheritance of the ancient riders transcended any simple accounting of influences and borrowings, victories and defeats, causes and effects. They had demonstrated that human beings possessed capacities that the settled world barely suspected, that with sufficient audacity and skill, a relatively small number of people could reshape the conditions under which entire civilizations operated. They had shown that liberty was not merely a political concept, but a way of being in the world, a commitment to possibility over security, to growth over stability, to the endless distance over the comfortable cage. The meadowlands where they had once ruled lay empty now of their herds and their camps, marked only by the burial mounds that rose like islands from the sea of green. But the seeds they had planted in the human imagination continued to sprout in unexpected places and unexpected times. Wherever people found themselves constrained by circumstances that seemed unchangeable and began to dream of transformation. Their true monument was not carved in stone or cast in bronze, but written in the breeze itself, in the endless movement of air across the grasslands that had been their kingdom and their temple, their battlefield and their home. And as long as that breeze continued to blow, carrying with it the scent of distant places and the promise of vistas yet to be explored. The spirit of the ancient riders would continue on, eternal and unconquerable, calling to all who had the courage to answer that the greatest adventures still lay ahead, waiting for those bold enough to mount their steeds and ride toward the sunrise.